Welcome everybody. Welcome to IMCW Center for Mindful Living, the virtual version. Welcome to Treasure Hunt. My name is Carl Skooglund. In this class, we explore the teachings of Buddhism's 2,500-year-old early tradition as they're recorded in what's known as the Pali Canon. These teachings, they give us the best chance of understanding what the Buddha himself and his early followers thought and taught about how to lead a human life. And as you've heard me say, I've not set this class up to be some sort of a academic, abstract exercise, simply becoming smart about a set of ancient texts. Instead, we want to see how they lay out a path that helps us negotiate our direct experience. We want to see how these teachings help us negotiate our lives and free ourselves up in ways that maybe we didn't think we could free ourselves up. And something to say too, I should have said this years ago. I don't consider myself to be a Pali expert, and I don't consider myself to be an expert in the suttas. Rather, I'm just a practitioner who has benefited a lot from using the teachings as a basis of practice, and just want to pass on a few of the things that I've picked up. In the last several teachings that we've covered, which are called the fruits of the contemplative life and two kinds of thought, we've come upon variations of the Buddha's path. Variations that are in addition to the more well-known Eightfold Path. But in both, we've found that there's a progression in that we first relieve ourselves in a preliminary kind of way of what we typically find to be distressing or enchanting. Okay, and then once relieved, the mind can come into some form of what's called samadhi, which is the Pali word for the mind being collected, settled, and composed. And then once collected, settled, and composed, we're in a position to see clearly and incline the mind to insight. And what the Buddhist tradition would have us see clearly, become insightful about, is what's called the conditioned nature of experience, which basically means that experience is all cobbled together, concocted. It being that way, the tradition says it is thus not able to provide reliable, lasting satisfaction. And in that way, conditioned experience is unsatisfactory. That is, it's dukkha. Okay. Dukkha being the Pali word that commonly gets translated as suffering. What the Buddha found is that once the mind becomes disenchanted with conditioned experience, disenchanted with dukkha, the mind is in a position to let go of its grip and thereby come into the unconditioned. Now, granted, until we get there, the idea, that idea of the unconditioned will remain a little abstract and far off. But the Buddha found that coming into the unconditioned does provide lasting, satisfying peace and happiness. Now, as practitioners, we'll certainly have our smaller scale moments of freedom from dukkha along the way, but there is an ultimate form of freedom, of liberation. And that's what the path would have us maintain as a possibility for ourselves. Now, this morning's teaching is a part 2 of a sutta from the collection called the Anguttara Nikaya, which is the numbered collection of discourses. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the teachings are arranged into lists of 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and so on. And this morning's teaching is from the Book of Eights, particular Anguttara Nikaya 8.6, and it's called the Lokadhamma Sutta, which is the teaching on the 8 worldly conditions. The 8 worldly conditions are gain and loss, fame and disgrace, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. Now, these 8 dhammas, these 8 things, they enchant us and they distress us. So this teaching fits into the part of the progression that I just spoke about. You know, the part that puts us in a position to see clearly once we gain a relative amount of relief around them. And to provide a little further context, you might also recall from the introduction to the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness, the realms of mindfulness. There's this one phrase at the beginning of that sutta. It goes, "A practitioner dwells contemplating, ardent, aware, and mindful, setting aside longing and distress with regard to the world." So that last part of the phrase, setting aside longing and distress with regard to the world, that's what this Lokadhamma Sutta is helping us out with. Okay, so just to say, it's not that we no longer care about the world. Instead, we're training ourselves, you know, becoming practiced, you might say, at not tethering our minds to the way the world is. You know, not basing our well-being, not basing our well-being on the way the world acts. Now, I sent out Bhikkhu Sujati's translation a couple days ago. I resent it. The translation of the Lokadhamma Sutta. Here's the meaning of the actual name of the sutta, Dutya Lokadhamma. Dutya simply means second, in that this is the second of 2 teachings on this that we find in that text. The first teaching is just a little bit shorter than this one. Loka means world. And it means the outer world, that is the world around us. It also means the human population, you know, just the people around us. And it also means the world of the 5 senses, which is an interesting one, which points out that, you know, if you think about it, anything we know about the outer world, it comes to us through the 5 senses. And by the way, loka in this sutta is the same Pali word we find in that section of the Satipatthana that I just quoted, you know, setting aside longing and distress with regard to the world, with regard to loka. Now, Dhamma is a word that has many meanings in Pali, and I won't go into all of them, but in our case, it means how the world of experience works. You know, how things are, or, you know, the processes by which things come to be as they are. So these 8 conditions, they arise, they come into being, they appear, they are produced, they present themselves to us, and as such, it could be said that they come and go like the wind. So very often we encounter the poetic translation of these dhammas being called the 8 worldly winds. And finally, sutta simply means teaching, and sutta is the Pali word, the Pali equivalent of the Sanskrit word sutra. Now, it's a relatively short teaching, but it is dense, and just so spot on, I think, in terms of describing the human experience. So it's justifiably one of the more frequently referred to teachings. Here's a basic outline of what we'll find in the text. First is that the 8 worldly conditions, as I said, are gain and loss, fame, disgrace, praise and blame, pleasure, and pain. Now, this teaching points out that those of us who are both educated and uneducated, taught and untaught, we all encounter these conditions. The difference between the taught and the untaught is that an untaught person does not reflect, does not consider that these conditions are impermanent and that they're suffering. That is, that they can't provide satisfaction. And because the untaught person does not understand the 8 conditions, the 8 conditions come to occupy the mind of that person. Now, chitta is the Pali word that here gets translated as mind. But chitta also refers to what we call the heart. Right? So what this passage means is that we get, emotionally and intellectually invested in the Lokadhammas. The next part is that because the untaught person does not reflect, they go on to favor gain, praise, fame, and pleasure, and they oppose loss, criticism, disgrace, and pain. And thus, an untaught person is not freed from suffering, not freed from wandering and from anguish. Now, the second half of the teaching simply sets out the flip side of this situation, and that is that a well-taught person does reflect, they do understand, their minds are not occupied, they do not favor and oppose, and thus they are freed. Now, this portrayal of people being taught or untaught, it can sound a little dismissive or contemptuous, right? Just to be honest. But I think all it's trying to do is to make the distinction between two conceptual possibilities, which play out, such that there are those of us in this world, in this human population, who don't conceive or have not yet conceived of a way of being alive that isn't based on loving one set of the conditions and on hating the other set of the conditions, right? The perception could be, or is, how could I not love gain, praise, and pleasure? The perception is that they're innately attractive. And on the flip side, there is the perception, how could I not dislike loss, criticism, and pain? The perception being that they're innately stressful. Now, this whole reference to being taught and untaught, it's not about, who we are as a person. Right? It's more about how we're thinking, how we're acting in any moment or any series of moments. If we're caught in the trap of thinking this is wrong, how could this be happening? Or in particular, how could this be happening to me? Then we're forgetting the facts of life, you might say. But we can remind ourselves, we can teach ourselves and become taught. We can make the shift in perception from this is wrong to, of course, this is the way it is. How could it be any other way? Now, this realization can take place over time, over a life of ups and downs, attending the school of hard knocks. It can also take place in an instant. In one passage in the Anguttara Nikaya, 1 verse 48, the Buddha says, he says, I know of no thing that is so quick to change as the mind. He goes on to say, in fact, it changes so quickly, it's not easy to give a simile. Now, in the last class in November, we covered the first pair of conditions, that is gain and loss. We covered gain and loss in terms of health, wealth, and family. We also touched on what are called the 5 reflections, which are that we are all subject to aging, illness, and death. Those are the first 3 of the 5. Next is that all that is dear to us is destined to change and pass away. And 5th, and finally, that we are all the owners of our actions. That we reap what we sow, for good and for ill. Now, that November class, it was so rich. If you didn't have a chance to be there, we got such great input and discussion around that from everybody. Again, if you missed it, I hope you'll check out the recording that's now on the IMCW website. So in today's class, I'd like to group together the next 4 of the 8, they being fame and disgrace, praise and blame. So fame and disgrace, these are the 2 poles of what constitute our reputation. Our reputation being something that's built up over time. Now, praise and blame, or praise and criticism, are the next 2, and with these, the time frame is a little more immediate, more in the moment. In this talk, I'd like to just use the shorthand of praise and criticism, for all 4 of these dhammas. And something else to ponder, these 4 things, they're set up to make up half of these 8 worldly conditions. The point is that this speaks to the proportion, it speaks to the relative weight that these things have in our lives. Our social conditions impact us, right? They have a big impact. This translation of the sutta says praise and criticism occupy the mind. Other translations we find are that they obsess the mind, they consume, they conquer the mind. Praise and criticism, it's the rare person that takes in these things just as neutral information. Right? Usually, this kind of social feedback, it's very sticky. Praise and criticism, it can take place in a moment, but the normal human response is to replay praise and criticism over and over in our minds, long after the moments that they've occurred. Again, they occupy, obsess, consume, they conquer the mind. And as social animals, praise is how we can, feel best. And again, as social animals, criticism, ostracism, that is how we can feel worst. I want to be a little unorthodox here and actually add one more pair to the Lokadhammas. And it's a pair that relates to fame and disgrace, praise and criticism. And that pair is success and failure, right? Because they also very much impact our social relations. They impact our social standing. You've probably heard the proverb, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. Success and failure, they impact, our relative standing in the social hierarchy, our relative position in the social order. Success and failure, they often determine, whether we get praise or whether we get criticism. Success and failure also feed back into whether we experience gain and loss. success and failure often play into how we rise and fall relative to our peers. Something that's interesting, I think, is that when we think of somebody as being conceited, it's that they, think very highly of themselves in a way that they think that they're better than others. But something you may know is that in the Buddhist tradition, conceit actually comes in three forms. The first is that, we think we're better than someone else. The second is that we think we're equal to someone else. And the third is that we think we're worse than someone else. So in Buddhism, any sort of comparison, any comparison of self to other is a form of conceit. So our susceptibility, our vulnerability to feedback, positive and negative, was something the Buddha taught about quite frequently. It comes up in a lot of texts. So here are some passages from the Dhammapada. This is verse 227. It goes, ancient is the saying. It is not just of today. So think about it, 2,500 years ago, this was ancient. They criticize one they criticize one sitting quietly. They criticize one speaking much. They criticize one speaking moderately. No one in the world is not criticized. Verse 134 of the Dhammapada points out the possibility of not being distressed by criticism. It says, hostile speech is painful, but if, like a broken bell, you do not reverberate, then you have attained nibbana. Verse 81 provides sort of a similar aspirational type of message. It says, as a solid mass of rock is not moved by the wind, so a sage is not moved by praise or criticism. The Samyutta Nikaya is a collection of teachings that are gathered around particular themes. Section 17 of that collection is all about what are called gains and honors. And it's a collection of 43 verses with a range of similes. I'll share just a few. In 1.2, it says honor and popularity are like a fishhook. Right? In 1.3, it says honor and popularity are like a harpoon. And relishing popularity is like the rope that's attached to the harpoon. So it's the relishing that's highlighted there. In 1.4, it says honor and popularity are like a long-haired sheep caught in a briar patch. In 1.5, it says honor and popularity are like a dung beetle. And I'll just let you think on that simile, on your own. In 1.9, it says that honor and popularity are like gale force winds affecting a high-flying bird. The bird's feet go one way, its wings another, its head another, and its body another, simile pointing out, how we can get wrenched in different directions by these comings and goings. In Samyutta Nikaya 7.2, we find a teaching called the Dharma Sutta, which gets translated as the abuser. What is also sometimes referred to as the teaching called the gift. In it, we find a Brahmin, someone of the Brahmin caste. His name was Bharadvaja, but his title was the rude or the abuser. And in this teaching, the Buddha was walking, through a village, and Bharadvaja, he comes up to him and he starts insulting him. He says, "You have no right to be teaching others." He shouted at the Buddha. He said, "You're as stupid as everyone else. You're nothing but a fake." He went on and on like this for a while. But the Buddha didn't get upset. Instead, he kind of waited for him to finish. And then he said, "Tell me, if you buy a gift for someone and that person does not accept the gift, to whom does the gift belong?" And Bharadvaja was a little confused by the question at that point, but he answered. He says, well, the gift would belong to me because I bought the gift. And then the Buddha responded, "That is correct. And that is exactly the same with your anger. Since I don't accept it, it remains yours alone." And at the end of the sutta, the Buddha includes this little piece of verse. He says, when you get angry at an angry person, you just make things worse for yourself. Now, this concern that we have with our social environment, as you may well know already, it's not superficial. The Buddha here is highlighting something that's deeply evolutionary. Groups of humans, groups of animals in general, that did not develop group norms and enforce them, they died out relative to groups that cooperated and kept each other in line. But this evolutionary advantage, the problem is that it doesn't care if we suffer or not. Okay. Thinking about this, I was reminded of a nature show that I was watching once. It was about baboons. The documentary was pointing out that they, or at least this one troop, was very successful in terms of food and protection and mating, but they had a strict social hierarchy. And at one point, there was a clip of a female that had been ostracized by the dominant female. And this female was off to the side of the group. There was a close-up, image of the female, and you could tell that this baboon was suffering. And it wasn't a physical kind of suffering; it was emotional. And the commentator said, this troop was so successful in a material way that now all of its suffering was social in nature. And I want to share a quick story, and that relates to this. And I actually want to ask if we could all unmute ourselves, because it might be possible that we enjoy a little bit of a laugh together. Years ago, I mentioned this in the last class, that years ago I was in a men's group, and we'd had dinner together once a month, and once a year we'd spend a weekend over in Rehoboth Beach. Now, one time when we were at Rehoboth, it was a Saturday afternoon, and we started pulling out the drinks and the snacks. And we were outside on a nice little screen porch, on one side of the house. And one of the guys, Jack, he walks up with his plate of cheese. Now, this cheese, it had a bad smell, and it wasn't just like, that's an unusual smell. It was more like, what the hell is that? What went wrong? What happened to it? And Jack, he says proudly, "It's Limburger cheese. I ordered it up special just for this weekend. It's great. Try it." And he starts waving it under our noses. Now, if you didn't know already, Limburger is famous or infamous And apparently, it's filled with the same kind of bacteria that you find in stinky feet. And although I do recall that it had what you might call subtle hints of rotting flesh.
Oh my God.
Anyway, well, we all started to complain, and we actually all got kind of mad at him. We said, Jack, that's awful. Get it away. But he wouldn't take it away, and we all got up and we started moving to other parts of the house. And the thing is, for the rest of the afternoon and for the rest of the evening, we'd settle in someplace, and then Jack would bring that Limburger over to where we were. And by the end of the night, Jack had finally put it away, but we were all really stressed out. We were all really on edge. And by about 10 o'clock, I had gone to bed. Oh, no. And my roommate, by the way, was John Kelly, who some of you may know is a fellow Buddhist and expert Pali translator. He's worked with Bhikkhu Bodhi. Anyway, we were both in bed, and we both heard Jack talking out in the dining area. Jack at this point, the poor guy had had about 5 glasses of wine at that point, and he was still upset. He still wanted to talk about why no one liked his cheese. And finally, one of the other guys, Mike, he tried to console Jack. And Mike said, Jack, what you did, it was bold. It was manly. But I don't think you've got a lot of support. And when we heard that, it was like a dam burst. And, all the stress that had been built up over the day was released. And both John and I went into these hysterical fits of laughter, just hauled up, curled up, crying with laughter. But Mike's observation, Jack, I don't think you've got a lot of support. That was the thing. Jack had all the sustenance that he needed. He had the cheese, and his suffering at that point, it was social. Anyway, and it's not just Jack, of course. We all want, the pat on the back. We want to feel validated. We want support. We want acceptance. That's the default. Anyway, the point of all this is that it's important to pay attention to, how we respond to, how we act within our social environment. If we think on it, we might see that we unknowingly and consciously spend quite a bit of mental effort, really put our hearts on the line, cobbling together and trying to keep propped up positive images of ourselves, that we want to create in our own minds and that we want to create in the minds of others. And on the other hand, we defend ourselves against negative images of ourselves in our own minds and in the minds of others. So it's about self-image, it's about biography, about what other people think about us. It's also about autobiography, what we think about ourselves. So when this text talks about the uneducated, ordinary person, again, that sounds unkind, but what it's really pointing to is how we act when we're just kind of going with the flow of our human conditioning, which in this case is tying our well-being back and forth to the back and forth, the ups and downs, the flickering notions of self-image, the hologram of self-image. I touched on this a little bit in the last class, but I think it's worth repeating. We create worlds of existence. This is one of the key concepts in the Buddhist tradition. And within those worlds of existence, we live out certain kinds of lives. So another way to think of it is that we create movies in our heads, and within the movie set, we're the star. But one fruit of the path is that we loosen up our identification with, and disengage from the movies. We free ourselves from these bubbles of reality. Another fruit of the path is that we also loosen up our identification with the movies that other people create in their own minds and want to apply to us. So all this being said, I want to introduce a complication. And that is that, we're not to totally ignore social feedback. That's not specifically what the tradition is telling us. It's not that we completely ignore praise and criticism. The goal is not to become like some rebellious teenager, who says, I don't care what anybody thinks. So for example, if our boss or our client, or a friend of ours, or, whatever the relationship is, if they give us feedback, it's not a matter of blowing it off and saying, I'm above all that. Here, I think is a useful approach that I once heard from Vipassana teacher Shinzen Young. He used this image in the context of views, how to relate to views, but I think it's also applicable to praise and to criticism. He set up this image of there being a piece of bait on a fishing hook. And our job is to carefully eat the bait, to find the sustenance there, find what's worthwhile without getting our mouth caught on the hook. Right? I also heard that Bhante Gunaratana once said, he's the abbot at the Bhavana Society in West Virginia. He said, if some piece of criticism is true, I should pay attention to it. If it's not true, then it's on them. It's their issue. It's not mine. And I should just let it go. So anyway, how might we actually practice with this, with praise and criticism? I want to offer up a few ideas. So as the text says, we might consider during meditation, or in moments of quiet reflection, that praise and criticism, we consider that they're impermanent. They're perishable, bound to go away. What we favor will go away, what we oppose will go away. We can also consider that they're dukkha, that they're not capable of providing lasting satisfaction. They're not worth tying our well-being to. Now, these are fairly straightforward reflections, and they can cut to the central issues very quickly. And it is possible to have very clear moments of, oh, right, of course, and come into authentic moments of release, by reflecting on these things. That being said, it might also be best if these approaches are backed up by a fairly developed appreciation of both impermanence and dukkha. Not just a superficial knowledge. Because what can happen is, and Misha pointed this out in our last class, is that these approaches, they can become a form of what's called spiritual bypassing, in which we use a piece of Dharma, to overlay, to cover over something, or ignore something that's there, or pretending or pretend that something is not there when it really is, when it really remains. So a second approach, if we find our hearts and minds, occupied, consumed, conquered, if we find that we're obsessing, it can really help to use some of the other frameworks that the tradition makes available to us. I'm thinking in particular of the 6 sense spheres and also the 5 aggregates. I won't go into the details of them now, but I want to share some of how those teachings might be used to reflect, when we find that we want to gain a little freedom, when we find that we keep getting caught in worlds created by favoring praise and opposing criticism. So really what we're doing with these frameworks, in this second approach is deconstructing our experience. So that what we might perceive to be kind of a monolithic, overwhelming, confusing mass of dukkha, it starts to become a little more discrete, when we apply these frameworks, a little more manageable and definable. So if you sit down to meditate, for example, or even if you're just walking down the sidewalk and a part of your mind wants to, abide independent, free of clinging, part of your mind would like to settle into the body, relax into the breathing, so that's one part of the mind. But then another part of the mind wants to hit the replay button, on something that someone said yesterday or, 3 years ago, or when you were a little kid, and then as a result, the mind keeps slipping into a world, slipping into a matrix created by favoring and opposing. If we find that happening, we can switch the intention from being primarily with the body and the breathing to being primarily with the process of favoring and opposing. We can explore the conditions that create favoring and opposing. Now, here's where I'm going to lay out some things, and it's going to sound a little technical, but I hope you'll hang with me. So in these moments of reflection, we can basically go down several lists. We can start with the sense spheres. We can ask ourselves, am I favoring some pleasurable sensation at the eye? Or am I opposing some painful sensation at the eye? Next, am I favoring some pleasurable sensation at the ear, or am I opposing some painful sensation at the ear? And it's the same pair of reflections with the nose, the tongue, and the body. Now, it might be obvious that praise and criticism, they don't have much of an impact, on the eye, ear, nose, and tongue. But the funny thing is, sometimes it can simply help to tally up all the areas where we're not actually getting identified, where we're not being bothered, and kind of provide a greater context for our experience. The one thing about praise and criticism in particular, it's the body where it can get really interesting, start to get interesting. Favoring and opposing will probably have an impact on the body. And I want to focus a little bit on the impacts of criticism, just by way of example. So again, when I'm opposing criticism, we can ask, where and how does that show up in the body? When I'm opposing criticism, where and how does it show up in the body? Where and how does it show up in the breathing? Now, just being in the body in this way, being with the probably not so pleasant sensations that might be occurring when we're dealing with criticism, it may not be fun. It probably won't be fun, but being clear and specific can make the experience manageable. The funny thing is the mind can settle in and be calm and stable with an unpleasant bodily sensation. And ironically, having the mind settle in and be clear, we can actually experience that part of it as being pleasant. Right? And an important thing is that this can also introduce a kind of confidence, kind of like, I can do this, I can be with this. So those are the first of the first five senses rather. The sixth sense, in Buddhism at least, the sixth sense is the mind. And here again is where it can get really interesting. Here, it can be really helpful to consider and to become clear about the whole range of perceptions, the whole range of narrative thinking that comes into play when we're getting overcome by criticism. And again, I'm going to focus on criticism just as an example. So we can be clear, make ourselves clear about the range of pleasant labels we like to apply to ourselves. We can become clear about the range of painful labels that we want to avoid. We can be plain about the range of labels and perceptions that might occupy our minds. Now, there are a number of qualities that I think are fair to say are universally valued, universally sought after. Most of us want to be thought of as competent, as smart, as trustworthy, as reliable. We don't want to be labeled as their opposite. We also want to be thought of as interesting, as worthy of attention, not ignored. This is a big one. We want to be, quote unquote, right. We want to feel that we're right, that our views are right. We don't want to be wrong. Now, there are other kinds of qualities that may be more particular to the person, or maybe particular to a certain circumstance that we find ourselves in. This is another layer that's interesting and helpful to pay attention to. So for example, there are some people that could care less about being thought of as a good cook. But if we set ourselves up that way, and somebody doesn't like our cheese, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. Some of us couldn't care, want to be thought of as a good athlete, or we don't care about it. As good looking, or we don't care about it. Or well dressed, or we don't care about that. We might get hung up about particular labels around our gender. Long story short, I accidentally bought some women's running gear, and I got it home and I thought, oh, this says women on the label, and I thought, am I okay with this? Should this upset me? Right? I just had this moment. It was affecting my sense of being a man. Is it okay? Being peaceful, being labeled as peaceful, that's an interesting one too. If we're peaceful instead of angry, or peaceful instead of worried, in some contexts, some social contexts, it might send a message that we don't care, right? Which is bad for our image. because we're supposed to be angry or worried about something. And if we're not, it signals that we're not bought into the program. We want to balance strength with kindness, although some people would just simply rather want to be thought of as tough than kind. We want humor to be balanced with seriousness. We want self-reliance to be balanced with connectedness. Too much self-reliance and we're labeled distant. Too much or too little self-reliance and we could veer into being clingy. Right? Again, just all these labels that we might consciously or unconsciously create and buy into. So becoming clear about the very particular labels and perceptions that we might be grasping at, it can help us immediately cut through the range of mental proliferation, the range of internal verbal narratives that get kicked up when we've experienced criticism. This can be huge because sometimes we stay caught in the narrative swirl. This can be a huge relief in and of itself. And this can happen when we become clear, again, about that bodily sensation that's getting kicked up and being okay with it. This can happen when we become very clear about the mental label, that we've inadvertently tethered our well-being to. And finally, so those are two approaches. The first one offered in the sutta, the next offered by this sort of range or this approach of deconstructing experience. The third practical approach I want to offer, to practice with praise and criticism is to not just look within. The third approach is to also look around, look around us, look at all the variety of ways in which all people tend to want to be perceived, viewed, thought of in particular pleasing ways, and not be perceived, viewed, labeled in particular unpleasing ways. It goes back to that part of the teaching we touched on in the last class. We can realize it's not just me. Okay. So to conclude the talk portion of the class, I just want to offer a reminder of how this effort, this practice fits into the context, to the overall context of practice. Going back to the Foundations of Mindfulness Sutta, again, these reflections on praise and criticism, they open up the possibility, as it says in the beginning of the sutta, that we might set aside longing and distress with regard to the world. And then there's also that possibility in the refrain of the Satipatthana Sutta, that possibility being we abide independent, not clinging to anything in the world. So that's a lot of talking on my end. I appreciate your attention here, and I do want to leave time for questions and comments, but I'd like to give ourselves a chance to practice a little bit, give ourselves a chance for the dust to settle a little bit. Practice, reflect a little bit, be quiet. So to help with that, if you want to stretch and or adjust your position a little bit, please feel free to do so now. Adjust your body, adjust your physical posture, adjust your mental posture, maybe by letting those views and concepts fall away for a while. Come into your own experience. If you would find it helpful, spend a moment or two to settle the mind within the body, within the breathing. Be clear for yourself what physical sensations confirm for you that you have a body. And within those bodily sensations, which confirm for you that you're breathing. How do you know that you're breathing right now? It might not seem very profound or insightful, but just providing ourselves practice settling the mind in these ways can give ourselves access to a kind of peace and happiness that we can make within ourselves, not rely on what goes on in the world. Again and again, breathe in and feel the body. Breathe out and relax the body. Relax the mind, relax the heart. If you find the mind starts to create and inhabit thought worlds, just wake yourself up out of them as soon as you can. You direct your attention to the body and the breathing. And be grateful that you've woken up rather than remaining caught. May our practice be of benefit to all beings. Thank you for your practice. We now have about a good 15 minutes for questions and comments if anybody wants to share.
I do. Thank you very much, Carl, for the very rich offering. Two concepts came up that for me are related to this discussion, and I think they might be related to the third way of practicing that you offered, looking around us, the universal experience part. Because one of the things for me with the fame and disgrace, praise and criticism, the social fabric, is that there are the more surface levels of that, where it's like trying to manage my perception of myself, other people's perception of me. There's a deeper layer of that, like the more basic human need, the more universal human need, rather than the kind of labels or perceptions I want or don't want, is that the need to be seen and the need to be accepted. And that helps me sometimes to get out of the more the weather and onto the ground. And those are social things: being seen, being accepted. So that ties into the second piece for me, which is humans, as far as I know, were the most social creatures that we know of. So there's both the evolutionary biology component in that. It's like, I think it arose with mammals or something and got more intense in primates. But there's this more recent science field, interpersonal neurobiology, that we actually develop in a social environment. And so I reflect sometimes, or especially during this talk, about the aspect of that. I mean, of course, there's a developmental piece, but here I am as an adult. And part of the way how I am a being is I'm interpersonally, I'm both individual and I'm inextricably embedded in part of both this social environment of humans and other creatures, but part of the all. So sometimes for me, that's what helps me get out of the personal part of the component and into that deeper well of it's not just about being human, not just be about being social specifically, but that inextricable part of everything. So it's like that deepest possible level of the inextricability. And that's the place in my practice where praise and blame can't hurt and can't help. Because no matter how much I can disengage from other people's perceptions of me and interpretations of me, their beliefs about me can make huge differences on my quality of life. I mean, Jesus of Nazareth ended up getting crucified as a result of other people's perceptions of him. Thanks.
Yeah, you were just a quick response. There's you raised the profound issue of this whole issue of interconnection, and isn't that important? And it most certainly is. And some parts of the tradition will say that that's the sort of one of the final forms of realization and manifestation, for sure. I think in the early tradition, that part of it's a little less emphasized, and it is more a matter of in the early tradition, emptiness had more of an aspect of letting go, letting go, letting go, again and again and again. And just personally, sometimes I've contemplated, when I'm feeling really connected with something or someone outside of me and feeling that sort of hit, that contentment. I think one of the other ways of approaching that is feeling understood and accepted. Is that switch is something that's already in me, and can I turn it on myself rather than rely on something outside of me? again, not something to just believe, but something to kind of experiment with and see how it works out, in your own experience. But it's not a small, that is not a small question. Not a small issue you're raising there, Misha. Yes, Kathleen. Oh, I think you're still muted. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Now am I on? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This relates a bit to Misha's comments. I was thinking about your amusing anecdote about the cheese and your friend. And it occurred to me that what made it funny was that he was identifying the cheese as part of himself.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, well, what if it wasn't cheese? What if it was himself that was smelly? How would that have changed the acceptability or the skillful responses or whatever of him and or those in the room who kind of parted company from him because of the unpleasantness of that sense experience from your perspective? Do you understand my question?
You mean if it wasn't
the cheese that we were bothered by, but actually, what if he had body odor?
Yeah, or just some other unpleasant attribute that you don't want to spend time around.
Exactly.
It's everything. I mean, the list goes on and on. The things that we prefer to be around and what we don't want to be around. I mean that.
But it wouldn't have been. But it wouldn't have been funny if you had behaved.
Right. Yeah. There's a little bit of comic distance, you might say, from it being the Limburger cheese.
Mm-hmm.
But there are ways in which when somebody is as a person, when it's not quite as you're saying, it's not funny anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but just to say, that this plays out in a myriad of ways. I did, I don't think in any one talk you can kind of tick through every part of the list, but I hope you might, again, sort of be able to explore on your own with just some of the ideas I've tossed out there. But did you want to rephrase the question so we can?
Well, I think if anything, I think the acceptability or the skillfulness or non-skillfulness of the behavior of everyone around him would have been perceived as different if you were really protecting him.
You're right. It would have been sort of more of an embarrassing situation, like, gosh, should we tell the guy?
Mm-hmm.
You've got your flies open. Should I tell you? Or and make sure to embarrass you, or should I kind of let you go, go on your way and maybe just go through life in blissful ignorance? There are all these funny things that come up.
Good morning. I want to add to that conversation, if I might.
Kathleen,
I love the way you brought that around to the person smelling, because I think the experiences of who we're with at Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, New Year's may put us in contact with people who are smelly, in a sense, that attribute that's not appealing. And how are we responding to that? Carl, you talked about moving away. It seemed like you all moved away from this.
We did.
And yet, if we couldn't laugh about the cheese, we're moving away from this.
At the time, it seemed like a wise thing to do.
Pardon?
Yeah. I'm joking. At this time, it just seemed like a wise, appropriate thing to do. Anyway, it smelled dangerous. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt. You go ahead.
No, it's good to keep laughing about it. But I think, we have this opportunity, and I'm only bringing up around the holiday bit because we're with some people all the time that we might not otherwise be with.
Mm-hmm.
and we may find ourselves moving away from those as well. We're not likely to call out at a holiday meal someone's behavior that we find smelly. And I'll just share that this recently happened for me over the holiday. And I had to keep saying to myself, which is so relevant to what we've been looking at today in the text. Yes, I'm suffering, but this is impermanent and it's going to stop because I'm not going to be around the smelly person all the time. Mm-hmm. And I found myself going away, good. I'm going to Sangha tonight, guys. I'll see you later. When I maybe wasn't planning on going to Sangha. But what was in the text about I've encountered a worldly condition that's unpleasant. But remember, it's impermanent. I am suffering and it is perishable. This will not last. And so neither did the Limburg cheese phenomena. Right. Thank you.
Mark, I think you're providing us with a technique that is kind of, I think, helpful in a very sort of rushed, confused, complicated social situation. If we have those sorts of little reminders that we can provide ourselves quickly, I mean, we're not going to have time for long reflections if we're engaged in a Thanksgiving meal, but we can have these little glimpses of, and Ralph touched on this last class too, just a quick recognition. This is dukkha, or, oh, this is Lokadhamma. This is what it is. And we can have those little very quick mind shifts, right? That one passage pointed out, it can happen in an instant. It can happen very fast. Wake up out of it in an instant. Yeah, Ralph.
I could take it one step farther. Having grown up with two autistic brothers, I can see people stepping back when, and even I today, dealing with my brother, I have to say, okay, this is how he is. Take a breath, be patient, and go back in and talk to him kindly, be compassionate about his world and all. I do recall talking to a young woman once who sat down at a party and next to someone in a wheelchair and was chatting with them for a while. And then later on, someone came up to her and said, "Oh, thank you so much for talking to my sister." And I said, "Well, sure, why not?" And nobody talks to people in wheelchairs. It's like, can we open our hearts a little? We get that moment of dukkha and suffering, and then take a breath and realize their suffering may go on. It's just a moment for us. That's just a thought.
Yeah, great one. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a comment in the chat. Oh, Emily, are you going to do that? Let's see. Okay, this is, I can't see now who it was from. Thank you, Carl, and all. Just some ideas. In place of the desire to be seen and to be accepted, a deeper natural Dharma perspective is, I believe, caring, which has two sides to it, loving kindness and compassion. This is to be practiced and cherished and best understood, and can be separated easily from the 8 worldly winds. The current conversation here also points to it. And the most fundamental wisdom, emptiness of inherent existence, may help us realize the interdependent nature of our experiences and their lack of self, and eventually no self. It incorporates impermanence and moves beyond.
Yes, thank you for reading that.
Wow. Carl, do you want to comment, or should? I mean, there's so much truth there for me.
Yeah, the one thing that there's a lot to take in there. What the the pieces on loving kindness and compassion. One idea that came up that I didn't include in the talk, and which this kind of points to, is that if that is our sort of background reality, kindness and compassion, if that is our vihara, right? If that is where the mind dwells, then we have a different way of experiencing the winds that come our way, right? Those winds take place in a completely different kind of mental environment within ourselves, and it gives us a better chance of not responding in ways that we might typically respond, getting hung up on things that might typically hang us up. So yeah, that's again, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right. Adil, is that right? Yes, thank you for putting that in.
So,
but we're at the end of our time. Emily, do you want to wrap us up, please?
oh, let's see. I would like to say that this is an offering given through the Center for Mindful Living. And if you would like to, please consider donating to the Center for Mindful Living. I should have this document up, and I lost it while I was taking notes and being very involved. But sorry. Well, it's living-mindfully.org is where you would find the way to donate. I'm sorry, I can't put that in the chat at the moment.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, I think most people know how to access that from the website.
Right. And
now.
Right. You're right. We're all familiar. Thank you very much, Carl. I had a question, but I don't want to hold people up. Were you?
If people need to move on to other things in their day, don't hesitate to do so. It's been, once again, great being with you all, but I'm happy to hang on a little while longer if people are interested.
Thank you, Carl, very much.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Bye.